Hello, I'm Cynthia from the University of Utah. Today, I'll be presenting our work on the impact of spinal cord injury on participation in human-centered research that I conducted with Ahmad Al-Salim and Professor Jason Weezy. Let's hear a recent experience of Ahmad. He wanted to test a novel accessible device with spinal cord injury patients in a rehabilitation hospital. Ahmad took help from occupational therapists for scheduling his trials. But during the trials, one patient was put under observation 3 consecutive times by the healthcare providers for health complications. Another patient had improvement in her health condition, and so she wanted to celebrate and did not participate in the trial that day. To summarize these situations, the OT commented that no one can really predict how things might progress with these patients. So Ahmad had to try multiple sessions with the patients to finish his trials. Similarly, accommodating the varying health conditions may result in situations that impact the research study. So this paper talks about the experiences of conducting research with spinal cord injury patients and aims to guide the HCI community in conducting more inclusive research with this population. With that aim, I will first talk about what is different with spinal cord injury patients. Then I will discuss how past HCI literature report their studies with this population, followed by reflection on our own experiences. I will conclude this talk with some guidelines for the HCI community. Now let's talk about what's different for this population. Spinal cord injury happens from damage to the spinal cord. It results in persistent changes in bodily functions below the level of injury. For instance, one might suffer from a resulting paraplegia, which is partial or total loss of functions of legs and trunk, or they might suffer from tetraplegia, which affects all 4 limbs. These patients might also lose other organ functions. While the impact really depends on the level and severity of injury, most of these impacts are persistent. Spinal cord injury also impacts a person's speech functions. Patients with more severe injuries have trouble breathing, requiring them to be on mechanical ventilator support. These patients can only speak when they exhale and wait for the ventilator to provide them enough air during the inhale period. It results in frequent and long pauses when they speak. These patients also get muscle fatigue quickly while speaking, and they have very low voice tone. But unlike motor functions, most patients recover some speech capability during the first year post-injury. The key issue here is, while some disabilities may improve over time and some disabilities are more permanent, these disabilities commonly come together when the injury occurs and impacts the patient's participation in research. So we need to consider multiple disabilities together. Now, as I mentioned about our recent experience, conducting research with this population is different. So the first step is looking at literature that might guide conducting research with people with multiple disabilities. However, most prior work guide on research with people with single disability. Some of them said conventional statistical techniques might not apply, while others listed which method can be applied for which type of disability. We found no guidance for research with people who have multiple disabilities, like in the case of a spinal cord injury. We wanted to know more about accommodating situations like what Ahmad had in his study. Since we could not find specific guidance from literature, we wanted to explore how other HCI researchers dealt with these scenarios. So we searched for papers published in the HCI venues with the keywords spinal cord injury, tetraplegia, quadriplegia, and paraplegia. We found 28 papers that report on HCI studies conducted with at least one participant with a spinal cord injury. However, most of the papers do not report a complete picture of their participants' disabilities. For instance, if they focus on motor disability of the participants, they just report that disability but does not mention other disabilities like speech or respiration. This becomes problematic when they report that they conducted hour-long interviews with the participants but do not report what was the participants' level of speech capability and if they had to make adjustments to those interviews. So we found limited to no details of the method adaptations if there were any. And lastly, they did not mention the duration of the injury, so we cannot even make assumptions how the disabilities might look like based on medical facts. For instance, we mentioned earlier that participants have more complications in the first year. I want to mention here that 2 of those 28 papers came from our lab group. So we mostly did not find any report on method adaptations in the papers we reviewed. So we went back to think what we experienced in the studies we reported in those papers. Though we have conducted other studies where we had similar experiences, in this talk I will only talk about the published projects to compare what we experienced and how much we reported in those papers. The other projects are discussed in the current paper. We designed 2 adaptive outdoor sports equipment for people with spinal cord injury, one for sailing, that is called the TetraSail, and the other for skiing, that is the TetraSki. In these projects, we collaborated with the rehabilitation experts and recruited participants who were at least 6 months post-injury, since the participation required stable health condition. During the iterative design process, we conducted interviews with the participants for feedback. But we found that participants had difficulty speaking and they fatigued faster while talking. So we had relatively shorter interviews, even as short as 5 minutes. Again, we had one spinal cord injured participant who also had locked-in syndrome, a neurological disorder that seizes the patient's ability to verbally communicate and perform any physical action. We had to adjust the questions for this patient so that he could reply with yes or no. We also used additional tools like a table with pre-labeled tags like numbers, yes, no, etc., so that he could select his answers from that table. We also found that noisy environments of the ski or sailing area made it challenging for us to conduct the interviews. And we had to evaluate the participants' abilities every time during recruitment for these longitudinal studies, since their abilities could vary dramatically between recruitments. Now note that in this slide, the blue colored text represent what we mentioned in our papers reporting these studies, and the red colored text represent what we did not report. As you can see, there are some participant information and method adaptations that we did not report well in our papers. Now let's rethink about what we have discussed so far. Medicine background tells us that these patients commonly have low voice tone, they fatigue faster, and they may require frequent pauses. In our tetrasport studies, we also had similar experiences like difficulty speaking and fatigue, and we ended up with relatively shorter interviews. So how would you actually conduct what we consider standard interviews with this population? Remember that in our review, we found studies that report hour-long interviews, but we did not find what was the patient's condition or if there were any adaptations. So in the worst case, these patients get excluded from the studies because of their multiple disabilities, but this should not happen since we do not want to marginalize the population. And in the best case, these patients were included, but the issues were not reported well in the paper as it happened with our own papers. As a result, even though researchers were able to come up with effective adaptations to collect rich data, we as readers do not know those from just the papers, and we keep reinventing the wheels. So we come up with some guidelines for the HCI community. First, I will talk about how researchers and practitioners can avoid marginalizing these people for their disabilities and how they can better report their experience and adaptations in the papers. Remember that people with spinal cord injury may have multiple disabilities, but we do not want to exclude them just because their disability might make it challenging for us to collect the data. For instance, even if some study wants to explore assistive devices for mobility, it should not exclude someone who has speech disability just because they cannot participate in interviews. So we also need to keep in mind that the degree of these disabilities can differ for each individual. Some may be able to speak clearly, some with pauses, others may not speak at all. But to adapt to their varying abilities, we need to either adapt our methods like we did for the patient with locked-in syndrome or combine different methods for data collection. As I discussed earlier, we found very few literature that reports such adaptations. As a result, when we started our study, we had to develop our own adaptations. Other researchers might be doing the same. So we suggest that while researchers make these adaptations, they keep note of them and report them in the resulting papers. This will help the readers to understand the broader context of the study, as well as guide new researchers on how they might want to adapt their methods. While we have listed other guidelines for every stages of the study in our paper, I discussed only 2 of them for the limited duration of this talk. Now let's talk about readers and reviewers, how they can help making research more inclusive for this population. As I have said earlier, research with people with spinal cord injury faces many obstacles. It might be difficult to find participants. The participants might have differing level of disabilities, and they may have more than one disability. These might result in fewer participants and several method adaptations. We urge the readers to consider the broader context of the study if reported in the paper while evaluating rigor of the study. Due to fewer participants and adapted methods, it is expected that the quantitative or qualitative analysis might not seem as strong as studies with non-disabled participants. However, we should recognize that they represent the researcher's sensitivity towards the needs of their participants and their passion for inclusive research. The other guidelines for readers and reviewers are discussed in our current paper. We believe these guidelines will help the research community to accommodate people with multiple disabilities in their research. Before concluding my talk, I would like to thank our colleagues at the Craig Nelson Rehabilitation Hospital for supporting us in conducting the studies with spinal cord injury patients. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out. Thank you for watching my talk.